Continuing on the 14th order, House Bill 1254. Madam Secretary.
Engross House Bill 1254 now with Senate amendments, a bill for an act to create and enact a new subdivision to Section 2 of Section 57 of the Code relating to a parent's choice individual income tax deduction for qualified educational expenses and to provide an effective date. The fiscal note indicates a reduction in general fund revenues for the 15-17 biennium of $1.2 million.
Senator Unruh.
Mr. President, House Bill 1254 would provide up to $5,000 per child in the form of a tax deduction to help parents making $120,000 jointly or less in taxable income to help meet the cost of books and tuition for private education institutions. This tax deduction equates to a tax savings of approximately $111 to $125 per child for those families who qualify. Both public and private schools have an important role in educating students for success in the ever-changing workforce needs of our state. This bill would incentivize the private sector to take some of the financial burden off the state and local taxpayers by supporting and building more schools. This bill also helps make private education a more viable choice for families of all walks of life and helps them provide what they feel is best for their children. Our committee learned that at one particular secondary education institution in our state, approximately 45% of families that attend receive some type of financial assistance from the school. This would help parents choose the educational setting that is best for their child. Overall, Mr. President, your Senate Finance and Tax Committee supported this bill with a vote of 4-3 and hopes that this body will support this concept as well.
Further discussion. Senator Rust.
Mr. President, make no mistake about it. House Bill 1254 is the beginning of a major policy shift for the state of North Dakota. Never before has any legislative assembly passed a bill that would do what this bill calls to do. This bill would provide a tax deduction to help parents defray the costs of tuition and books at a non-public school. It essentially allows, through a backdoor maneuver, state dollars going to non-public schools. Schools that operate on a different set of principles with regard to religion, due process, special needs, and a number of other things. I believe the state should not hinder parents from home educating their children or from placing them in a controlled, religious-based environment. They certainly should have and do have that choice. However, the state should not, in essence, subsidize a dual system where one of the systems doesn't have to operate under the same rules. State dollars should go, as Section 1, Article 8 of the state's Constitution says, for the establishment and maintenance of a system of public schools which shall be open to all children of the state and free from sectarian control. While no dollars are appropriated or paid directly to non-public schools, the end result of those tax deductions essentially does the same. The state of North Dakota has long held that public tax dollars should not go to private causes. That is good policy. I urge you to not go down this separate but unequal road. Please continue to do what has long been good policy by voting red on House Bill 1254.
Senator Triplett.
Mr. President, I was one of the 3 who voted against this bill in committee, and I concur wholeheartedly with the comments of the previous speaker. For those who would say that this is a small deduction and not that big of a deal, I just want to share a bit of the testimony that we received in committee, in which one of the primary proponents, not a legislator, but a citizen testifying on behalf of the bill, indicated a very clear and strong intention that his goal, and he believed the goal of many people who support the bill, is the full support of private educational institutions by the state. And The argument that they brought forward was that because a student may be in private school, that therefore the expense of educating that student is removed from the state's obligation, and therefore they are essentially doing the state's work for them. I think this is an incredibly dangerous argument, and the response, I think, is that if something bad happened in a particular community, say a flood, which happens occasionally in North Dakota, and a private school were wiped out in the flood, they could choose by their board of directors simply to close the school, and they would be off the hook for educating those students. The state of North Dakota doesn't have that same prerogative. Those students would then become a burden on the state system instantaneously, and the state would be obliged to provide for them. In my community, I lived through a big flood that destroyed several schools, and the school district had to scramble to find alternate locations and portables and get the school up and running in just a few weeks over the summer, and they did that. And the state always will do that. The state has a constitutional obligation, as the previous speaker said, to fund K-12 education, and we will always keep that commitment. And I can say that with a great deal of assurance because we always have kept that commitment in the past, even when our state was so incredibly broke that there was almost no money for anything. We still somehow managed to finance K-12 education. And so I think we just need to remember that at the core, the obligation is ours as a state, and the priority always has to be toward that constitutional obligation. And we as legislators need to uphold the long-standing history that we've had virtually since prior to even to having a constitution, that public dollars go to fund public education. I would encourage a no vote.
Senator Larson.
Mr. President, when this bill was being read, House Bill 1254, if you looked at the wall there, it said 1254, so a little strange. This is not a $5,000 deduction, it's a credit. So what that's going to be for a family is about $114. I can currently deduct books and supplies for my kids going to college, and I don't understand why I should not be able to deduct these books and supplies while they're in lower education. These parents of these students are spending or saving $11,000 a year to the state. So they're putting in their taxes and paying taxes, and yet their children aren't using the public school system. So they're doing more than their fair share on it. The current status of this formula with K-12 is over $2 billion. So I just think that it would be a good idea to, let these folks go out for a $114 dinner once a year. We should be doing more than that.
Senator Wansik.
Mr. President and fellow senators, parents that send their children to private school essentially pay for both systems of education in our state, public and private. They save our state a great deal of money while they're also paying taxes for the public school. These are parents that are committed to education and committed to their children. As it's been said, this $5,000 is not a tax credit, it's a deduction. And I called my tax preparer, and the rate at the $120,000 level for state taxes is 2.27%. Well, that amounts to $113.50. That's the maximum that any one student or parents could receive off their tax bill. for each child. And when you figure we have 6,800 students going to private schools in this state, when I look at the fiscal note apparently is assuming that every single child will qualify, every single child will meet the $5,000 expenditure maximum, and every single parent for every single one of those children will be filing for that full refund through the deduction. I don't believe that's so, especially when you limit it to $120,000 of taxable income per household or for parents at that level. That's going to eliminate a large number of them too. So I don't believe this is going to cost our state that much. And when you look at the DPI summary of facts, the state spends nearly $11,000 for every student to educate them in our state. So these parents are saving our state $75 million, and we can't help them with $1 million. They're also helping pay the $2 billion worth of payments to our public schools. To me, this is not going to change the way we fund public education. I will continue to support public education. This is about helping parents, in my opinion. This money is not going to any specific parochial or private school or non-public school. It's going back to these parents to help them with the efforts of educating their child. These are parents that make decisions in what's in the best interest of their children. I know parents and families that have some children because of one reason or another sent to a private school and other children being sent to the public school. They're making those decisions. This is about empowering parents. It's not about risk to the public school system. I find it astonishing that they are that concerned with this or feel that threatened with this bill. This is about helping parents, and as most of you know, I've said it a number of times, we all like to help and do something for our children, and I can't think of anything more helpful and assisting and helping our children more than empowering their parents and helping them take care of their children and making these decisions. So I would hope you would give this support and help North Dakota's parents, especially those ones that are paying for both systems of education in North Dakota.
Senator Kilzer.
Mr. President, school choice is something that's being more and more taken away from our families, and it is one of the reasons why we're having more social service problems in this area. And I would urge that we pass the bill. The private schools, the non-public schools, have a good standing locally. Our two public high schools in Bismarck have a ACT average of 20.3 and 21.7 respectively. The two private schools, one of them is about 2 points higher and the other one's about 3 points higher. When you're a parent looking for a place to send your kid, one of the things that you consider is the ACT average of the classes in that school. So I would urge you to pass the bill. The amount of money, from my standpoint, is almost minuscule. I assume the fiscal note is accurate, a little over $1 million. Well, you know something? I've sent 6 of my kids through the non-public school system. So if you figure 6 kids times 12 years times about $10,000, my family alone has saved the state about $700,000. So I think 1.1 million, and to say that it takes away money from the public schools, I mean, that's hard to swallow. I just don't believe it. So I would urge that we not continue to allow choice to slip away from families when it comes to the education of their kids. And this is happening. I find more and more parents all the time that tell me, you know, the tuition in the non-public schools is going up. In Bismarck, it's around $3,000 a year. If you have several kids, it's true, they can't afford it. And the competition that's coming from the higher salaries that we're giving to teachers and to schools is becoming more, it has more of an effect upon the non-public schools than it has in the past. So this is kind of passively something that we're allowing to happen. So I would urge that we try to level the playing field a little bit more, although it won't ever be perfectly level.
Senator Elke.
Mr. President, I have a question for the carrier.
State the question, please.
Mr. President, I'm a little embarrassed to ask this question. I am on the same committee as she is. But lines 16 through 18 talk about expenses means the amount expended for each qualifying child for books and tuition relating to the child's education at a non-public school. It doesn't say anything about it being a non-public North Dakota school. It just says a non-public school, and I'm just curious if that means that if your child was going to a non-public school out of state, if that would qualify you for that same deduction.
Senator Unruh, do you wish to answer the question?
Mr. President, that point was not specifically discussed in committee, so I would imagine my fellow committeeman would also not know the answer to that question. Quite possibly, maybe our chair knows the answer, but I do not.
Senator Judy Lee.
Mr. President, I think it's important that we look at this and just about every other bill that we're considering in this body in a global way and not just each bill independently. We just approved amendments this afternoon that are going to reduce income tax. One of the few taxes that my constituents have never given me a lot of static about. Now we're talking about another one. We have had many bills of that sort that we have supported in this body. In the meantime, the members of the Human Services Committee are trying to figure out how to live with the kinds of cuts that are coming along. I was at an event this morning where it was discussed that the minimum wage in this community and the adjoining one is about $15 an hour. You know what we're enabled to pay quality service providers on the Human Services budget right now? $9. How in the world are we going to do that? Some of these students and families that might make a choice, because that's what it is, a choice about going to a non-public school, may benefit from some of these services being provided also that we are absolutely not supporting at the right level. So I urge you to consider where your priorities might be. Maybe this is it. But we need to look at what the bottom line is with the budget, whatever it is that we're looking for our ending fund balance, and we know we have a target there, and where the money can best be used. And every time we do one of these, there's a little bit less or a lot less that's available in some other place that some of us might view as a priority. It's a little like being bitten to death by a duck when you sit in the Human Services Committee. Each of these nibbles isn't terminal, but by George, when you put them all together, they really hurt. And there's a point where you just don't know how it's going to make it out. So I encourage a no vote on 1254.
Senator Dever.
Mr. President, I suppose you could call this an indirect contribution to private education if it was a tax credit. But it's not a tax credit, it's a tax deduction. I was involved in the startup of a private school here in Bismarck several years ago, and it was interesting to me to find out at that time that if you contributed in the amount of tuition for one student on the federal tax level, it was deductible. But if you contributed to a specific student, it was not deductible. That seems to me to be kind of a fine line. So you can contribute any amount to any private education that you want and get a tax deduction. So here we're talking about your child. And I think that this is not too much to ask. It should be available at the federal level just as it would become at the state level. But Mr. President, I think maybe it would be interesting to consider in our DPI budget the the amount of the avoided costs that are covered by private education that we're not needing to fund on the state level. This is not a lot of money. I think it indicates some support for private education, but not a direct contribution from the state.
Senator Lueck.
Mr. President, a question for the carrier.
Please state your question.
As the question was asked before about different private schools, I'm wondering about homeschoolers, if that is included in this.
Senator Unruh, do you wish to answer the question?
Mr. President, homeschoolers were also not discussed in committee. I don't believe that would qualify for this tax deduction, since it's not a primary, a secondary education facility, institution.
Senator Flacco.
Well, Mr. President, I think most of you know I have no children, so I happily provide dollars for education, whether it's through donations or through the tax dollars, which, like yourselves, I pay willingly and with the knowledge that dollars for education are clearly the best investment we can make in our state. You know, we have in the past provided some support for a variety of different things with needs-based and merit-based scholarships, and I've been trying to be a champion on that. You know, to say that we do this in a vacuum, not recognizing that, and I think the fiscal note's too high. I think it's not what it should be, to be honest. But I also note that yesterday, $140 million was cut out of the K-12 funding bill in the other chamber, including per student payments and approximately $40 million for at-risk students. Recently, we've been grappling on another committee I serve of whether we can afford an additional $25,000 for families and victims of those who were affected for generations by herbicide defoliant. Those are all decisions I have to think of in my mind in terms of priorities that I have to make when I lay my head down at night. We all recognize that private schools do a very good job of educating the students that they accept into their programs. You know, I would note too that I find it rather interesting that some who may not support, if you look at, you know, the voting lists in some of these, who would not support early childhood education for public schools, we're in essence, through a surreptitious route, providing, in essence, through very clever funding methodology, state dollars for those same early childhood education programs for other programs that are non-public. I fully recognize that the bill offers up some very clever options, and the sponsor's desire to be clear, I do not view this as a voucher program. I mean, some have referred to it as. I do not in any way feel that. But I don't think it's necessarily, as the senator from District 2 said, that it's necessarily in keeping with the spirit of the Constitution. To an earlier question to the carrier of the bill, I contacted Legislative Counsel and their division director, and if I may, Mr. President, read, if that would be helpful.
If there's no objection, without objection.
To the question, the bill applies by its terms to a non-public school. The bill does not restrict the school to be in this state. It appears tuition for attending a school outside North Dakota would also qualify. And they go on, another consideration is that the credit is not restricted to residents. A non-resident parent with North Dakota income could theoretically claim the credit for a child attending private schools outside North Dakota. The parent and the child in the school could have no contact with North Dakota other than some taxable. And finally, the last part of the quote is, as you observed, the bill does not address how divorced parents use this credit. It is not entirely clear divorced parents could get the credit, as the wording refers a joint return or married filing separately. So, Mr. President, You know, it seems in some cases that we don't provide these same, and I think there were some amendments offered up in committee about also providing some of these same provisions for parents who send their children to public schools, whether it be for books or other things that they have. They even talked about fees. So my question to the carrier would be, would they be able to deduct AP, advanced placement, or, Mr. President, dual credit classes that they take at the private institution as part of this, because public schools, the parents have to pay a portion of that. And I'm curious if this would allow those if this bill were to pass, from obtaining tax deductions for something that isn't afforded to everyone in the state.
Senator Unruh, question has been posed. Do you wish to answer that question?
Mr. President, could I have the senator from District 44 repeat the question one more time, please?
Senator Flacco, would you repeat the question, please?
Mr. President, and to the senator from District 33, my question is, many students take advanced placement or dual credit classes while they're in high school. Those can count for, in some cases, college credits, or for both high school and or college. So it can be deemed part of their academic program in high school. Would those, if that was blended into their cost of education, be deductible under this scenario?
Senator Unruh?
Thank you, Mr. President. In response to the senator from District 44, qualified educational expenses are anything that qualifies under books and tuition relating to the child's education at a non-public school. So yes, I believe those could potentially qualify for the tax deduction. Another clarification as well would be that the question asked about homeschoolers earlier, they would not qualify for this tax deduction because that is not a non-public school. They would not be attending a non-public school. And I also wanted to make a correction to the senator from District 44 as well. The portion of the Century Code that this tax deduction is listed under specifies that for purposes of this section, if I may, Mr. President, read from the code.
If there's no objection.
That this applies to North Dakota taxable income. So.
Senator Poolman.
Well, Mr. President, I just want to echo the comments of our last speaker in saying that this is not a voucher bill. I have received emails from my colleagues who have been told that this is a voucher bill we're debating today. And I just want to make sure that we all understand that this is a tax deduction. It's not a voucher bill, and it shouldn't be misrepresented as one. If this is a voucher bill, I hope we will have the voucher debate with every tax credit deduction or incentive we pass through this chamber. What we are debating here today is a tax deduction. The state of North Dakota gives tax incentives for all sorts of things: angel fund investments, workforce investments, internship programs, business expenses, wind energy companies, endowment donations, and charitable contributions, just to name a few. But some want to draw the line at organizations providing education to children. People in this chamber already know that I am a product of public education. I'm the daughter of a public school teacher. I have been a public school teacher for 18 years, and we send all 3 of our children to public school. In no way do I worry that this bill will compromise my salary, resources, or the quality of education for my children, because it won't. Here in the legislature, we hire independent consultants to give us the cost to educate an average student, and we commit to funding 80% of those costs. The parents who will take advantage of this tax deduction will still pay full property taxes to their local districts to provide the other 20%. This bill won't impact any of that. What this bill will do is acknowledge that we value parental choice in finding the best educational environment for our children, and an understanding that it isn't always found in a public school setting. We say we value educational choice, but the reality is that the choice is only available to families who can afford it. Simply allowing private schools to exist doesn't truly offer choice, especially in a state where schools are so full we must deny open enrollment requests. This bill is one small way for us to help families who want or need options, and I would encourage the Senate to support it.
Senator Cook.
Well, Mr. President, I wished I could have spoke before that last speaker from District 7, but I just want to make one clarification. I believe if you read 19, you'll see a definition for qualified child. You'll see that that definition means anybody who is a non-public student. So I think it would include homeschooled children.
Senator Schneider.
Mr. President, I appreciate the thorough debate that we're having on this today, and having not been on the committee that heard this bill, just have an additional question. I understand full well that this would not be limited to schools in-state or in-state students, but take, for example, a child who's 17 years old and decides to go to, let's say, Georgetown or Notre Dame or some college like that. And then there's another student who decides to go to the U of M. Are we entering into a situation where possibly the parents of the child, the 17-year-old child that goes to Georgetown, would get a deduction, whereas the parents of the child who goes to U of M that's 17, that they would not? Did the committee consider that?
Senator Unruh, do you wish to answer the question?
Mr. President, no, your committee didn't discuss that particular situation, so I guess I can't respond.
Senator Miller.
Mr. President, I think we have to remember that we're talking about a $5,000 deduction, and you have to make and if you make a substantial amount of money, it's not going to be really beneficial to you at all. The issue that some people kept talking about, out of state, sending your child out of state, I want to remind the Senate that up in my district, in the corner of North Dakota, there's a group of people that have a certain religious conviction, and they have their own school. But because of the way North Dakota operates, they found it more advantageous to have their school in Minnesota. So they moved across the river and set up their school there. Now they are excellent contributors to the local economy. They have many businesses. They have tire shops, and they build all kinds of products up in there in little town of Nitchie. And I think this is just a small benefit to them that they can take advantage of something for the tremendous cost they've outlaid so that they can properly educate their children in an environment that they see fit. And this takes away the expenses to the state. This is a good bill.
Senator Shively.
Well, Mr. President, if any more people get up, we won't have to take the vote, but just a short comment, I guess. This isn't a question of whether it's good for a private school, whether it's going to hurt a public school, and it's not the amount that we're talking about. The question is, it's a major shift in our tax policy of how we fund education, and if we're going to go down the road of allowing state money to go to private schools. And I guess that, if we're thinking of helping them, yes, but it's the care we take in how we fund our systems. And I guess I'm kind of scared of this policy shift of going down the private education. Not that this is a big amount, not that it's going to really upset the apple cart of what's funding K-12, but it's definitely a policy shift of the state of North Dakota of how we fund education, and it's probably something that we really should think about.
Senator Anderson.
Mr. President, my concern on this issue is the constitutional question of the separation of church and state. And whether you feel like this issue gets into that or not, just be sure that unintended consequences down the road, that you will be able to defend your religious schools against the state once they become dependent on tax deductions or some other method of funding, and also that you will be able to defend the state from the schools when they all get dependent on your money. Thank you.
Any further discussion? Any further discussion? Hearing none, the question is on the final passage of House Bill 1254. Would the Secretary please open the key? Each senator record your vote. All senators have voted. Any senator wishing to change their vote? Second